It was Sarah's first day at the office. She stepped into the gleaming lobby, the air crisp with the smell of fresh coffee and new beginnings. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The building seemed imposing, its glass windows reflecting a skyline Sarah had dreamed of for years. She was excited, of course. This was the opportunity she had worked so hard for. The receptionist smiled at her, handing her a visitor badge and pointing to the elevators. She nodded politely, but couldn't help feeling the nerves bubbling up inside. This wasn't her first job, but it felt different. This was big. She rode the elevator to the top floor, heart pounding in anticipation. When the doors opened, she was greeted by a sea of cubicles. The faint click-clack of keyboards and soft murmur of voices filled the air, and the hum of productivity seemed to settle over everything. David stood near a window on the far side of the office, his back straight, his posture composed. Sarah could tell he was a manager. The way he carried himself, the authority in his voice as he spoke to a few of the employees gathered around him. She wasn't sure why, but something about his presence made her feel uneasy. It wasn't him, not exactly, but there was a certain coldness in the way people looked at him, or perhaps more accurately, didn't look at him. David glanced over, catching Sarah's eye. He smiled, a polite, neutral smile. She returned it, though she couldn't shake the feeling that something unspoken hung in the air. She wasn't sure why, but as she approached him for their first introduction, she noticed how the employees around her subtly shifted, turning away or glancing down. She tried to brush it off as the jitters of a first day, but something told her it wasn't just the building that made her feel this way. David gave Sarah a brief tour of the office, his tone friendly but professional. His office was minimal, neat, and well organized, a place that suggested a man who didn't waste time. As they passed various departments, Sarah tried to engage in light conversation, but each interaction felt forced. The employees she met were polite but distant, nodding as they acknowledged her presence. And then there was David. While he spoke warmly, she could sense a layer of caution behind his words. He was open, but only to a point, just enough to let her know he was approachable, but never too much. She sensed that maybe this was a defense mechanism. Maybe he was used to holding himself back. When they arrived at her desk, Sarah's heart fluttered again. She was eager to start, but the feeling of isolation was undeniable. As she sat down to settle into her new workspace, she noticed something strange. Several of her colleagues, even the ones who had been friendly moments before, were now conspicuously avoiding eye contact. She couldn't put her finger on it, but she felt like she was stepping into something far more complicated than she'd first realized. It was time for the first team meeting. Sarah arrived early, eager to meet her colleagues and learn more about the projects she'd be working on. The room filled quickly, with most of the team members chatting amongst themselves. Sarah took a seat near the front. David walked in last, quietly, and took his place at the head of the table. The meeting began. David introduced the agenda in a calm, even tone, but as he spoke, Sarah noticed something, an almost imperceptible tension in the room. People were listening to him, but not with the full engagement she had expected. They were nodding, yes, but their attention seemed to wander. The moment David finished speaking, John, the head of the marketing team, quickly jumped in, brushing off David's ideas with an air of dismissiveness. "I'm not sure if this is quite what we need, David," John said, his tone sharp but veiled with faux politeness. "Maybe we can revisit this in a more detailed meeting later." Sarah shifted in her seat, her stomach turning. There was something about the way John dismissed David's input that felt off. The rest of the room didn't challenge John's words. They nodded, as if waiting for the go-ahead to move on. Sarah felt a flutter of discomfort rise in her chest, but she remained silent. David took a deep breath, his eyes flicking momentarily to Sarah as if gauging her response. Then, in a calm voice that barely betrayed any emotion, he nodded. "Okay, let's move on." The meeting continued, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling of discomfort. It was as if David wasn't just being dismissed for his ideas. He was being dismissed because of who he was. During the lunch break, Sarah found herself walking toward the break room, hoping to engage with her colleagues. A couple of people smiled and waved as she entered, but again, David was nowhere to be seen. Sarah grabbed her coffee and walked around the room, looking for a seat. Rebecca, one of the team members, sat down with her. Rebecca was in her late 20s, with bright eyes and an effortless charisma. She smiled at Sarah, but there was a coolness to her smile, like something was being held back. They made small talk about their work, but soon, the conversation shifted. "How do you like it here so far?" Rebecca asked, her voice light. "It's great. Everyone seems nice, though I did notice, well, it's a little different than I expected." "I guess I'm still adjusting," Sarah replied, her words tentative. Rebecca raised an eyebrow. "Different how?" she asked, taking a slow sip of her coffee. Sarah hesitated. "I don't know. It just feels like some people are a little cold toward David." Rebecca's smile faltered for a moment, her gaze drifting off to the side. "You mean his management style?" she asked carefully. Sarah nodded. "Yeah, I guess. It just feels like he's trying hard to make an impression, but people are just not responding." Rebecca let out a low chuckle. "Well, maybe he's just trying a little too hard. You know, trying to fit into a mold that wasn't made for him." Sarah blinked. "What do you mean?" Rebecca shrugged nonchalantly. "Oh, you know. I'm sure he's qualified for the job, but, I mean, we all know how these things work, right? Corporate diversity initiatives, and all that." Sarah's stomach twisted. She didn't know how to respond. She could feel the weight of Rebecca's words, heavy with an unspoken truth, and it unsettled her deeply. By the end of the day, Sarah was tired, mentally drained from all the social interactions and the undercurrents she hadn't fully understood. She sat at her desk, staring at her computer screen. The office was mostly empty now. Most employees had gone home for the day, but David remained, quietly typing away at his own desk. Sarah couldn't help but glance over at him every few minutes. There was something about the way he worked. Steady, focused, and yet so alone. She saw that he wasn't getting up to chat with anyone, nor did he seem to be engaged with the casual conversations that had filled the office earlier. Eventually, David stood and walked over to her desk. His steps were measured, as though he was weighing each one. Sarah stood up quickly, hoping she didn't look too flustered. "How's your first day going?" David asked, his voice calm and professional. But Sarah could sense a layer of fatigue beneath the words. It's been a lot," she said, her voice a little unsure. "Everyone's been great, but it's just a little different from what I expected." David smiled softly, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I understand. It can be overwhelming, but I think you'll get the hang of it. You've got the skills for it." There was a silence between them, one that neither seemed to want to break. David looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "I'll check in tomorrow to see how things are going," he said finally, before walking toward the elevator, his footsteps echoing in the empty office. The following day, Sarah entered the conference room for the second team meeting. David had prepared a detailed proposal for an upcoming project, one that was critical for the company's next quarter. He walked in, holding a thick binder filled with notes, and as he began to present his ideas, it was clear he was passionate about the plan. But before he could even get through the first few points, John interrupted. "I don't think that's going to work," he said dismissively. "We need something simpler, something that's easier for the team to execute." David paused. "I believe this plan can work, but it will take some adjustment. It's not simple, but that's why it's effective." John didn't look impressed. "I'm just saying, we can't afford to take risks right now. Let's scale it down." He glanced around the room, his eyes seeking approval from the other team members. Sarah could feel her heart race. She wanted to say something, to defend David, but the room was already turning against him. The comments continued to fly, and before long, David's proposal was reduced to a few hastily scribbled notes on a whiteboard, none of which had been his original ideas. The meeting ended with no resolution, and Sarah felt sick to her stomach. She had witnessed a pattern of behavior that seemed to go unnoticed by everyone else, and David, as always, was left to pick up the pieces of a system that didn't see him for what he truly was. Later that afternoon, as Sarah grabbed a coffee, she caught sight of Rebecca and John talking near the printer. Their conversation paused as they noticed her walking past. Rebecca's smile was polite but distant. "You know, Rebecca said with a casual shrug. David's just not the right fit for a leadership role, don't you think? Sarah stopped in her tracks, her mind racing. She tried to speak, to defend David, but the words wouldn't come. She wasn't sure if it was the pressure or the fear of standing up in front of these people, but for the first time, she felt utterly alone. That evening, as Sarah sat at her desk, she couldn't shake the image of David's calm, collected face in the midst of all the chaos. It was as though he had learned to expect this, to accept the rejection and the cold indifference that had followed him through his career. She realized that this wasn't just about the office. It was about something deeper, something systemic. She leaned back in her chair, staring out at the city lights through the large glass windows. For the first time, Sarah understood. She was in a place where talent was ignored, where effort was dismissed, and where people like David were fighting a battle every day that most didn't even know existed. And yet, Sarah couldn't help but wonder, what was she going to do about it? The next morning, Sarah found herself walking toward the water cooler, feeling the weight of yesterday's events settle on her shoulders. She tried to focus on her work, but her mind kept drifting back to the conversation with Rebecca and the way John had dismissed David's proposal so easily. It wasn't just the proposal that bothered her. It was the way David had been treated, as though his opinions didn't matter, as though his presence was a nuisance. As Sarah filled her cup, she overheard Rebecca and a few others gathered in the corner, talking in low voices, clearly unaware that Sarah had just entered. "Have you heard the latest from HR?" Rebecca asked, her tone a mix of gossip and distaste. "They're seriously talking about pushing more diversity in management. Can you believe that? I swear, every time I turn around, it's diversity this, diversity that. Just because they hired him doesn't mean they actually care about results." Another voice chimed in. Sarah didn't recognize it, but the harshness in the words made her skin crawl. Rebecca laughed quietly. "Yeah, well, I've heard David's barely holding it together. I mean, it's not like he's really leading, right? I don't know why they keep pushing him into these roles." Sarah's stomach twisted in discomfort, her coffee cup gripped tightly in her hand. The insinuations were clear, and the subtle cruelty in Rebecca's words wasn't lost on her. She took a slow breath, standing silently, unsure if she should interrupt or simply walk away. Before she could make a decision, John came around the corner, his voice booming with that same smugness that made Sarah's skin itch. "What's the deal with David, anyway?" he asked, glancing at Rebecca with a chuckle. "I swear, the guy can't get out of his own way." Sarah's heart raced, but her mouth remained sealed. The small voice inside her told her that speaking up wouldn't end well. Her colleagues were already giving her sideways glances ever since her intervention at the meeting. The tension was palpable, and she felt it again as she realized that she was not just an observer in this office. She was now part of the problem if she said nothing. She turned quickly, pretending not to hear any further, and walked back to her desk, her mind clouded with unease. By the time the team gathered in the conference room for the afternoon meeting, Sarah felt herself withdraw into the background, her sense of discomfort growing heavier with each passing moment. David entered the room, his face as calm and collected as ever, but Sarah couldn't help but notice the weariness in his eyes, the slight slump of his shoulders that spoke volumes about what he had endured. Today, he was presenting a new approach for an upcoming project, one he had spent weeks refining. He was passionate about it, and it was clear that he believed in the potential of his plan. But the moment he began to speak, Sarah could see the familiar cold reception take root. John was the first to interrupt. "This looks promising, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. I think we need to dial it back a bit. Too ambitious, don't you think?" The rest of the room murmured in agreement, each person's comment mirroring the previous. John had a way of sounding reasonable while quietly undermining David's authority, and before long, the room had shifted its focus away from David's proposal to John's more practical approach. David stood there, his face a mask of professional detachment, but Sarah could see the flicker of frustration in his eyes. He cleared his throat and tried again. "I believe this approach could give us a competitive edge, but I understand it might seem like a risk. I'm open to feedback." John, not missing a beat, countered. "Let's be real here. No one's going to go for something this risky right now. We need something easy to implement." The dismissal was subtle, but unmistakable. David's suggestion wasn't just being criticized, it was being disregarded completely. Sarah felt her chest tighten. She had seen how these things played out before. An idea, born of thoughtful planning and insight, crushed under the weight of prejudice, masked by polite words and gentle rebukes. She wanted to speak up. She wanted to tell them that David's plan deserved a chance, that he wasn't just filling a quota or getting by, he was working just as hard, if not harder, than anyone else in the room. But the words caught in her throat, and she felt her courage waver. As the conversation continued around her, she realized just how deeply ingrained the biases were. This wasn't just about one project or one person. It was about an entire system that treated people like David as less than. Later that afternoon, Sarah found herself standing in the hallway, waiting for the elevator. She had been working steadily, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the meeting. The subtle cruelty, the way David was treated like an afterthought. It weighed on her, and she couldn't shake the sense that she was watching something bigger unfold. Something she didn't fully understand but knew was wrong. As she waited, she saw David walking down the hall toward her. He gave her a quick, almost imperceptible nod, but there was something in his eyes. Something that spoke to a depth of exhaustion she hadn't noticed before. The elevator door opened, and Sarah stepped inside, holding the door open for him. "Thanks," he said, his voice quiet, almost too soft for the space around them. The ride to the top floor was silent, save for the soft hum of the elevator. Sarah stared at the glowing numbers above the door as they ascended. She could feel the tension between them, the weight of the conversation they weren't having. She wanted to ask him how he was doing, if he was okay, but she feared the question would be too intrusive. Finally, she broke the silence. "David, are you okay? And with the way they treated your ideas?" He looked at her, his expression unreadable. For a moment, she thought he might brush it off, but instead, he gave a small, rueful smile. "It's nothing new," he said, his voice steady, but there was a sadness there she couldn't ignore. "I've been here long enough to know how it goes. You learn to pick your battles." Sarah frowned, unsure of how to respond. She wanted to say more, wanted to promise him that she wouldn't stand by and watch this happen, but the words escaped her. The elevator dinged as it reached their floor. David stepped out, giving her a brief glance before walking down the hallway toward his office. The next day, as Sarah headed into the restroom for a quick break, she overheard a conversation just beyond the door. The voices were familiar, Rebecca's and John's, along with a few others she didn't recognize. "Have you seen the way Sarah's been acting lately?" Rebecca asked, her voice dripping with judgment. "She's always hanging around David. It's like she's trying to make him feel better about himself or something. It's not like he needs the help, right?" John's laughter followed. "Yeah, she's trying to play the white savior. I guess she thinks if she gets in his good graces, she'll look like a hero. But I'm not buying it." Sarah's heart sank as she realized they were talking about her. The door opened, and she quickly stepped inside, hoping they hadn't noticed her presence. The comments stung, not just because they were directed at her, but because they were a reflection of the way her colleagues viewed David, and, by extension, anyone who dared to stand with him. She washed her hands in silence, her thoughts racing. Could she really make a difference? Or was she just as complicit in this office's system of prejudice as everyone else? That afternoon, Sarah attended a team lunch, a casual affair in the break room where everyone was supposed to bond over pizza and discuss their work. But as soon as she entered, she realized something was off. David was seated at the far side of the room, alone, picking at his food. No one had joined him, not even the people who had spoken to her warmly in passing. Sarah hesitated. She wanted to go sit with him, to make him feel included, but the silence around the room was deafening. As she made her way toward the table, she noticed that Rebecca and John were sitting together at a different corner, their voices louder than the rest, laughing and talking about anything but work. Sarah could feel the tension in the air. She sat down near David, giving him a small smile, but he barely acknowledged her. It wasn't out of rudeness. It was as though he had already accepted his place in this unspoken hierarchy, a place where he was always on the outside looking in. The rest of the lunch passed in an uncomfortable silence. The team was polite, but the subtle exclusion was clear. David, ever the professional, said nothing. Sarah, on the other hand, was slowly realizing just how deeply embedded the racism was in this office. The following day, as Sarah was sitting at her desk, she received an unexpected visitor. Emily, a senior employee from the IT department who had been with the company for years. Emily wasn't someone Sarah had interacted with much, but she had always struck Sarah as professional and unpretentious. "I saw you with David yesterday," Emily said, sitting down across from Sarah. Her tone was calm but direct. "You know, a lot of people around here think they can get away with treating him like an outsider, but I know better. He's good at what he does, and that's all that matters." Sarah looked at Emily, surprised. "You're not bothered by how things are handled?" Emily shook her head. "I'm not blind. I've seen it for years. I've just learned to stay out of it. But I know you're new, and you're probably feeling like this whole place is a little off." "It is. You're not imagining it." Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her. Finally, someone who understood. As the days passed, Sarah continued to witness more subtle, hurtful exchanges. Words that didn't just undermine David's professional abilities, but his humanity. She had tried to stand back, tried to stay neutral, but with each passing moment, she felt herself becoming more complicit. And then, one morning, Sarah found herself standing outside David's office. She had planned to just speak with him briefly, but as she reached for the doorknob, she stopped. The door was slightly ajar, and inside, David was having a tense conversation with John. From what she could overhear, David was being told that the team no longer wanted to take his approach on the project. He was being asked to step aside and allow John to take the lead. The words were like a punch to the gut. Sarah knew then that she couldn't stand by anymore. That afternoon, Sarah stood in the middle of the break room. Everyone was chatting casually, their voices blending together in a dull hum. But Sarah knew she had to say something, do something. Taking a deep breath, she spoke up. "I don't think it's okay the way David's being treated," she said, her voice shaking at first but gaining strength as she continued. "He's doing great work, and it's not fair to just brush him aside like this." The room fell silent, and for a moment, Sarah felt exposed. But she stood her ground. "If you can't see his worth, maybe it's time to take a step back and look at yourselves." John's eyes narrowed, but Sarah didn't back down. The other employees shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke up in opposition. The day after Sarah spoke out in the break room, the atmosphere in the office was thick with tension. It wasn't overt. No one came out and confronted her directly, but the coldness was palpable. Sarah could feel the eyes on her as she walked through the corridors, the whispered conversations that ceased as soon as she passed. At her desk, she tried to focus on her work, but the uneasy silence from her colleagues hung over her like a storm cloud. She had expected resistance, but not this subtle but sharp distance. She glanced across the room at David's desk. He was already at work, head bent over his computer, as if nothing had changed. But Sarah could see the slight tension in his shoulders. He had noticed. By midday, she found herself alone in the break room again, staring at her reflection in the microwave door. She thought back to her words yesterday. Had they been too rash? Had she done the right thing? She hadn't even realized just how many people in the office would have taken offense to her intervention. Rebecca entered the break room, her footsteps light but deliberate. She paused when she saw Sarah, a tight smile on her face. "So, you decided to speak up, huh?" Rebecca said, the words almost too sweet to be genuine. "How's that working out for you?" Sarah felt a prickling sensation in her chest. "I think people just need to understand that it's not about race, it's about fairness. David deserves a chance." Rebecca raised an eyebrow, a mocking edge creeping into her voice. "Oh, we get it. You're all about helping the underdog, right? But maybe you're not seeing the bigger picture here. This isn't about fairness, it's about fitting in." Sarah's stomach turned as she realized the unspoken message Rebecca was sending. Fitting in didn't mean embracing diversity. It meant conforming to a norm that excluded people like David, people who were already different in the eyes of the team. Rebecca left without saying another word, her parting glance loaded with an implied threat. Later that afternoon, Sarah was called into her manager, Lisa's office. Lisa had always been friendly, though a bit distant. But now Sarah noticed an edge in her tone. "Sarah, can we talk for a moment?" Lisa asked, her voice professional but firm. "Of course," Sarah replied, sitting down across from Lisa's desk. "I've heard some things about the comments you made yesterday," Lisa said, folding her hands. "While I admire that you want to stand up for what's right, I need to remind you that the office culture here isn't one where we speak out like that. You need to be careful about how you approach these situations. We don't want to cause unnecessary tension or drama." Sarah's heart sank. "I didn't mean to cause trouble. I know, Sarah," Lisa interrupted, her voice softer now. "I'm not saying you don't have good intentions, but sometimes speaking up can have unintended consequences. I just think you need to think about how these comments affect team dynamics." The words hit like a blow. Sarah had always known that standing up for what was right came with risks, but she hadn't anticipated this kind of pushback. The message was clear. Her moral stance was not welcomed in this workplace. What was worse, Lisa wasn't directly condemning her. She was simply offering her a warning, a subtle suggestion that this was not the place for these kinds of issues. The next day, Sarah entered the office early, hoping to find a moment of peace before the whirlwind of the workday began. She arrived to find an email waiting in her inbox, a company-wide update. The subject line read, "Changes to project leadership." When Sarah opened it, she froze. The email announced that David would be stepping down from his position as project manager for the upcoming initiative. The role would be reassigned to John, effective immediately. Sarah's heart sank. She had suspected something like this might happen, but seeing it in writing made it all too real. She immediately got up from her desk and made her way to David's office. When she entered, she found David sitting behind his desk, staring blankly at his computer. His expression was unreadable, and the weariness that had once been a subtle undertone now seemed like the only thing left in him. "David, I just saw the email," Sarah said gently, her voice laced with sympathy. "I'm really sorry." David didn't look up. "It's fine," he replied, his voice flat. "This is how it goes. You can only push so hard before the system pushes back." Sarah took a step closer, unsure of how to offer comfort without seeming intrusive. "But you don't deserve this. You've worked hard, and your ideas are good. I just don't understand why they didn't listen." David finished for her, finally looking up. "You're right, but that's the way it works around here. It's not about who's good at their job, it's about who fits in. I never fit in, and neither will anyone else who's not like them." He paused and looked at her, his gaze searching. "You know that now, right?" Sarah swallowed, her throat tight. She hadn't fully grasped the depth of David's disillusionment until now, but she could feel it. The bitter resignation in his voice, the exhaustion that had taken hold of him. "I don't want to see you leave," she said quietly. David smiled faintly, a sad, rueful expression. "It's not about leaving. It's about knowing when to stop fighting a fight you can't win." Sarah stood there, feeling powerless. She had spoken up, but it hadn't changed anything. If anything, it had made things worse for David. She knew that if she didn't do something soon, the whole system would continue to crush him, just as it had crushed everyone who had ever tried to challenge it. Later that afternoon, Sarah bumped into Lisa once again, this time near the elevator. Lisa gave her a tight-lipped smile. "How's everything going, Sarah?" Lisa asked, as if she didn't already know. "Not great," Sarah admitted, her voice tinged with frustration. "I don't understand why David is being pushed out. His ideas were solid. He didn't deserve to be sidelined like this." Lisa's smile faltered for just a second, but she quickly recovered. "Sarah, I understand that you're upset, but you need to understand the bigger picture. David's removal wasn't a personal decision. It was a business decision. And, sometimes, business decisions have to outweigh personal feelings." Sarah felt the anger rise in her chest. "You're telling me this is just business? That's it?" Lisa's eyes flickered briefly with something that could have been guilt, but her tone remained steady. "It's not personal, Sarah. It's about what's best for the team." The conversation ended there, but Sarah was left fuming. Lisa's words rang hollow, and the more Sarah thought about them, the more she realized the truth that had been hidden beneath the surface. David wasn't being pushed out because of his ability, it was because of who he was. Later that evening, as Sarah prepared to leave the office, she found herself standing by David's office door once again. This time, she didn't hesitate. She knocked lightly before entering. David looked up, and for a brief moment, their eyes met. There was no anger, no bitterness in his gaze, only exhaustion, as if he'd given everything he had to give. "I wanted to apologize for what happened," Sarah said, her voice shaky. "I thought speaking out would help, but now I see it just made things worse. I'm sorry." David didn't respond immediately. He simply looked at her for a long moment. Finally, he spoke, his voice quieter than before. "You were trying to do the right thing. Don't apologize for that. But, Sarah, you have to understand. Change doesn't come easy. Not here." Sarah nodded, tears threatening to well up in her eyes. She had hoped for a different outcome, but now she understood. Real change wouldn't come overnight. It was a battle that would take time and sacrifice. David stood up from his desk and walked toward her. "But you don't have to stop. If you believe in this, and what's right, you can't stop fighting, even if it costs you." The words hung in the air as Sarah left the office, her mind swirling with doubt, but also with something new, a sense of purpose. The next morning, Sarah walked into the office with a renewed sense of determination. She had been quiet, too quiet for too long, but David's words echoed in her mind. "If you believe in this, and what's right, you can't stop fighting." She sat down at her desk, opened her email, and began drafting a message to HR, a formal request for a meeting to discuss the ongoing issues of discrimination and exclusion in the workplace. It was time to take the fight to the next level. It was time for change. The days following Sarah's formal request to HR were filled with a tense quietness. The usual hum of the office felt different now, like everyone was waiting for something. Perhaps for the storm Sarah had unknowingly started to settle. Sarah sat at her desk, fingers hovering over her keyboard, but she couldn't focus on the task at hand. Every email she read, every conversation she overheard, felt like it had a hidden agenda. The people around her were on edge. Her colleagues had already formed their opinions about her and her actions. A few days later, HR sent Sarah a meeting request. She had known it was coming. The company's higher-ups would surely want to discuss her concerns and her recent push for change. But what Sarah wasn't prepared for was the way it would feel. Her stomach churned as she walked toward the HR office, a mix of dread and determination bubbling inside her. When she stepped into the HR office, she was greeted by the familiar faces of HR manager Angela and her assistant, Ben. They exchanged polite smiles, but there was an undeniable tension hanging in the air. "Please, take a seat," Angela said, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. Sarah sat down, trying to steady her breathing. Angela folded her hands together. "Sarah, we wanted to meet with you to discuss some of your recent comments. We've received feedback from several colleagues regarding your concerns about diversity and leadership dynamics within the team. We take this seriously, of course, but I have to be frank. Some people have expressed feeling uncomfortable with the way things were handled, especially when you publicly spoke about David's removal from the project." Sarah bit her lip, trying to keep her calm. "I understand that people might feel uncomfortable, but this isn't about feelings. This is about fairness. David wasn't just removed from a project. He was ignored, undermined, and ultimately pushed out because of who he is. It's not just about him. This is a systemic issue. People like him, people of color, are routinely overlooked and dismissed. And I can't stay silent about that." Angela's expression didn't change, but Sarah could see the shift in her eyes. "Sarah, I hear you," Angela said, her voice careful, measured. "But the way this was handled, speaking out in a team meeting, then following up with HR, could be seen as creating division. We want to make sure the workplace is collaborative, and sometimes these things can escalate." "I'm not trying to divide the team," Sarah said quickly. "I'm trying to make it better. We can't keep pretending that everything is fine when it's clearly not." Ben shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "But sometimes," he interjected, "people need to be mindful of how they voice concerns. This could have been handled more discreetly, Sarah." You could have talked to David privately, or come to HR first. There's a process in place for these things. The words hit Sarah like a slap. So, you're telling me that speaking up wasn't the right thing to do? She asked, her voice trembling with a mix of frustration and disbelief. Angela's tone softened, but it lacked the empathy Sarah was hoping for. What we're saying is that there are channels to follow, and we have to balance addressing concerns with maintaining the harmony of the team. You understand that, right? Sarah didn't answer immediately. Her heart was pounding in her chest. She wasn't just hearing an explanation. She was hearing a justification, a way of silencing dissent without addressing the root of the problem. We'll look into this further, Angela added, signaling the end of the meeting. But for now, we ask that you remain focused on your work and continue contributing to a positive environment. Sarah stood up, nodding stiffly. Of course. But I won't stay silent about this, she added, her voice steady. This isn't going away. As she left the room, Sarah felt a surge of both frustration and resolve. She was being told to conform, to stop rocking the boat, but she knew she couldn't. Not now. Not when she was finally seeing the full scope of the problem. That evening, after the HR meeting, Sarah found herself walking home in a daze. Her thoughts were a blur, angry, confused, but also empowered in a way she hadn't expected. The more she thought about the meeting, the more it became clear. The company wasn't interested in change. They weren't willing to address the real issues. They just wanted her to fall in line, to stop making waves. And that realization was a slap in the face. At home, Sarah poured herself a glass of wine and sat down in front of her laptop. She couldn't go on like this, pretending that everything was okay. Her phone buzzed on the table. It was a message from David, sent earlier that evening. I'm leaving tomorrow. They offered me another position, but it's not worth it. I don't think I'll ever be seen as anything more than what I am to them, just a token. Sarah stared at the message, her heart sinking. She had known this was coming, but seeing it in black and white made it final. David was leaving, and the system had won. But as she read the message again, something stirred inside her. This wasn't over. She wasn't going to let David's resignation be the end of it. She opened a new document on her laptop and started typing. It wasn't just a letter to HR anymore. It was a call to action, a manifesto, a letter to the entire company. By morning, Sarah had written something she never thought she'd write. A letter calling out the company's institutionalized racism, its failure to genuinely support diversity, and the way it marginalized people like David. She didn't plan to send it to HR alone. She was going to send it to the entire company. As she sat down at her desk that morning, her pulse quickened. She knew the risks. She could lose her job, her career, everything. But there was no turning back now. Before sending it, she stopped to think for a moment. There was no turning back. She knew the company wouldn't just let this go. She'd be making enemies, not just with the higher-ups, but with everyone who had a stake in maintaining the status quo. But she couldn't stay silent. She hit send. The email went out just after the morning meeting. Within minutes, Sarah started receiving messages, some of support, others more hostile. Her inbox was flooded with responses. One email stood out. It was from Emily, the senior IT employee who had spoken to her earlier. The subject line read, "You did the right thing. I've been here longer than most, Sarah, and I've seen what happens when we don't speak up. I know it's not easy, but you're not alone. This office has been long overdue for some real change. Don't give up. We need more like you." Sarah felt a surge of hope. Emily's message was a lifeline, a sign that not everyone in the company was willing to let this go unnoticed. But then, the next message was from Rebecca, and it was anything but supportive. "You've really gone and done it now, haven't you? Do you think this is going to fix things? You've made a mess of everything. You've made it harder for the rest of us to just get through our days without all of this drama. Not everyone is going to be on your side. Think about that." Rebecca's words stung, but Sarah knew she had to stay focused. There would be more messages like that. She had expected this backlash, but she also knew that this was the beginning of something bigger. Later that day, as Sarah was preparing to leave for the evening, she was called into Lisa's office again. The door was slightly ajar, and when Sarah walked in, she could see Lisa sitting with her arms crossed, her expression stern. "I received your email, Sarah," Lisa began, her tone sharp. "I have to say, I'm very disappointed in your decision to send this out to the entire company. This is not the way we handle issues. It's disruptive and damaging to team morale. Do you have any idea what you've done?" Sarah's heart raced, but she stood her ground. "I know exactly what I've done, Lisa. I've opened people's eyes to what's really happening in this office, and I'm not sorry for that." Lisa's expression hardened. "We don't tolerate behavior like this. You've made it very clear that you're not happy here, and that's fine. But I think it's time we had a conversation about what happens next." Sarah knew exactly what that meant. This was the company's way of telling her to stop, or else. But Sarah was done playing by their rules. "I'm not going to stop. Not until things change." That night, as Sarah walked out of the building, she was met with an unexpected sight. A group of her colleagues, employees from all departments, were standing outside, gathered in a small group near the entrance. It was Emily who stepped forward first. "We saw your email," Emily said, her voice quiet but resolute. "And we stand with you, Sarah. We're tired of the way things are here too." More people stepped forward, including a few who had once been hesitant to speak up. They were tired of the silence, tired of letting things continue as they always had. Sarah had started a spark, and now, it was beginning to grow. For the first time since she started this journey, Sarah felt a glimmer of hope. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about all of them. And maybe, just maybe, change was finally within reach. The days following Sarah's email had been a whirlwind. The company was in an uproar, and though Sarah was initially isolated, something unexpected had happened. Employees who had silently watched the office dynamics unfold for years were starting to speak up. They were tired, just like Sarah, of the unspoken tension and the status quo that seemed to benefit only the powerful. The next morning, Sarah arrived at the office to find a message waiting for her in her inbox. This time, not from HR or her manager, but from one of the engineers named Lucas, a quiet man who had worked at the company for over 5 years. "I read your email. I've been here a long time, and I know how things work. I wanted to say that I support you. If you need anything, I'm here." Lucas wasn't the only one. Sarah soon realized that the message boards on the company intranet had started to fill with anonymous posts calling for more diversity and transparency within the company. While some posts were critical of Sarah's approach, many were aligned with her message. She wasn't just one voice anymore. The conversation had started, and now others were adding their voices to it. That afternoon, Sarah met with Emily in the break room. Emily, who had been with the company the longest, had seen it all. If there was anyone who understood the dynamics of the office, it was her. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said," Emily began. "You were right to call out the system. But you're not alone in this. There are more of us who want to see change." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "You mean you want to help?" Emily smiled, but it was a rare expression, one that felt like a true moment of camaraderie. "I've been keeping my head down for years, but I can't stay quiet anymore. I've seen what happens when people like David are pushed out, and I can't be a part of that anymore." Sarah felt a wave of relief. Emily's support was a turning point. "Thank you," Sarah said. "I'm going to need all the help I can get, but we can't just keep talking about it. We need action." Emily nodded. "I know people in IT, in finance, in HR. We could start something, a petition, a task force, something to show the higher-ups that we're serious." The pieces were falling into place. Sarah wasn't just going to fight this battle on her own. She now had allies who shared her vision. A few days after her meeting with Emily, Sarah found herself sitting in the boardroom, facing the company's executive team. The atmosphere was tense. Lisa was there, as were other senior managers, including John, who was now leading the project that had once been David's. Sarah had been summoned to discuss the fallout from her email, and she knew it wasn't going to be a pleasant conversation. Lisa sat at the head of the table, her hands clasped in front of her. "Sarah," she began, her tone cold but measured, "we've reviewed the concerns you raised, and while we appreciate the initiative, it's clear that your approach has caused more harm than good. We've had complaints from several departments, and morale is lower than ever." Sarah didn't flinch. "Morale is low because the people here aren't heard. They feel marginalized. I've been hearing from people in departments I've never even interacted with, and they're all saying the same thing. They're tired of being ignored. John chimed in, a smug look on his face. You're making a mess of things, Sarah. You think sending out a mass email is going to fix this? You've just alienated half the team. Sarah's eyes flickered to him. She'd known John would try to undermine her, but his words only fueled her resolve. If you want things to stay the same, then yes, my actions will alienate people. But if you want real change, then maybe it's time for this company to stop hiding behind team morale and start focusing on fairness and transparency. Lisa leaned forward, her voice cutting through the room. You've put us in a difficult position, Sarah, and I'm afraid this can't continue. Sarah held her ground, even as the pressure in the room mounted. I'm not backing down. If you think this is going to go away, you're wrong. People are ready for change, and I'm not the only one who feels this way. Lisa's face hardened, and for a moment, the room was silent. Then, in a sharp tone, she said, "We'll discuss this further. But know this, Sarah. We cannot allow disruptions like this to continue." As Sarah stood to leave, she could feel the weight of their disapproval bearing down on her, but she was no longer afraid. She had the support of others. She had made her stand, and now it was time for them to decide whether they would listen or continue to protect the system that had kept people like David from succeeding. The following week, Sarah's email had started a ripple effect that was more far-reaching than she could have ever imagined. She received more messages of support, not just from her colleagues, but from people in other departments, including managers who had remained quiet until now. It was Emily who had suggested taking the next step, creating a more formal, organized effort to push for systemic change. Together, they came up with a plan. They would form an informal coalition, a task force dedicated to addressing diversity and inclusion issues within the company. It wouldn't be enough to simply talk about it. They needed to show the company that they weren't backing down. We can't just hope the higher-ups will listen. We need to show them that we're serious, Emily said as they brainstormed. We'll need signatures, data, and a clear proposal. We can present it as a formal request to HR and the executive team. Sarah agreed. I'll write up a proposal. We'll need everyone's input, both from the marginalized employees and those who support us. Soon, Sarah, Emily, and their growing group of supporters were in full swing. They reached out to people from every corner of the company, people who had never spoken up before but were now ready to lend their voices to the cause. One afternoon, Sarah sat in a meeting with several colleagues, including Lucas, and they began drafting a document that outlined the major concerns within the company. The lack of diversity at the top, the failure to create an inclusive environment for people of color, and the systemic issues that led to discrimination. They compiled data on hiring practices, leadership demographics, and employee turnover. It was becoming clear that what Sarah had initially thought was an isolated issue was, in fact, part of a much larger problem. As the document took shape, Sarah's sense of purpose grew stronger. She had a vision for change, and now she had a team of allies who were committed to seeing it through. It was a month after Sarah's email that they finally had a meeting with the executive team. This time, however, the tone was different. Sarah walked into the boardroom, flanked by Emily and Lucas, carrying the petition they had worked on together. Over 100 employees had signed it. It wasn't just a collection of names, it was a statement. People were ready for change. Lisa, John, and the rest of the executives were already seated when they entered. Sarah, Emily, and Lucas sat down, and without waiting for the formalities, Sarah spoke. We've gathered over 100 signatures from employees across the company, she began, her voice steady. We've outlined specific actions we believe the company needs to take to become a truly inclusive and equitable workplace. This isn't just about David. This is about all the employees who feel they have no voice here. Lisa looked at the petition but remained silent. John opened his mouth to speak but was silenced by a pointed look from Lisa. We're willing to listen, Lisa said finally, after a long pause. But I need to make one thing clear. This is going to take time. We can't make changes overnight. Sarah didn't flinch. We understand that. But we're not asking for overnight change. We're asking for a commitment to real change. We need leadership to step up and take responsibility. Lisa looked down at the petition once more. We'll review this and get back to you with our plan." As Sarah and her team left the room, they exchanged quiet but triumphant smiles. It wasn't a victory yet, but it was a start. The executives had acknowledged the petition, and for the first time, they were being forced to face the reality of the company's failures. They couldn't keep ignoring the problem. The following weeks were filled with back-and-forth meetings with HR and the executive team. But as Sarah and her allies continued to push for concrete changes, they began to see some progress. The company agreed to hold a series of diversity and inclusion workshops, and for the first time, they promised to make hiring practices more transparent. There were also talks of creating mentorship programs for employees of color to ensure that they had access to leadership opportunities. Though the changes were small, they were significant. The tide was turning. That evening, Sarah sat with Emily and Lucas in the break room, looking at the list of upcoming initiatives. They had won this small battle, but there was more work ahead. "We've only just started," Emily said, smiling. "But it's a start." Sarah nodded. "And it's a good one." The day after the meeting with the executives, Sarah could feel the undercurrent of tension growing stronger. She had expected some resistance. After all, significant change never came easy. But what she didn't anticipate was the level of hostility that now seemed to be simmering in the office. It started with a conversation she overheard in the break room. Two senior managers, Rebecca and John, were speaking in hushed tones, but Sarah caught enough of their words to know the mood was turning against her. "We can't let this go too far," Rebecca was saying, her voice low but intense. "We'll lose all control if we keep letting these initiatives take hold. It's bad for business, bad for morale." John agreed. Sarah and her little group of supporters think they're changing the world, but they're just stirring the pot. "We can't have that." As Sarah stood there, pretending not to listen, the words stung. Rebecca and John weren't just talking about her. They were talking about everyone who was rallying behind the cause for change. When Sarah went back to her desk, she noticed a few colleagues looking at her differently. It wasn't overt, but the air felt colder. The subtle whispers and sideways glances were a clear sign that the backlash had begun. Later that afternoon, as she was heading out for a coffee break, Emily sent her a quick message. "It's getting worse. A few of the senior managers are starting to isolate us. John's already spreading rumors that we're causing trouble." Sarah typed back quickly, "I expected this. They won't be able to ignore us for long. But we need to be careful. This could get ugly." The divide in the office was becoming more pronounced. It was no longer just Sarah and a few allies versus the system. It was Sarah and her group of supporters versus a network of those who had a vested interest in maintaining the status quo. Lucas, who had become one of Sarah's strongest allies, came by her desk the next day with an urgent look on his face. "Have you noticed anything strange?" he asked quietly, his eyes scanning the room. "People are starting to get weird around me. Like they're talking behind my back. I overheard some folks in IT saying they're questioning my commitment to the team. They're trying to make this about loyalty, not about change." Sarah's stomach turned. "I've heard whispers. They're trying to turn this into a loyalty issue. Like we're the ones causing the problem by speaking out." "Exactly," Lucas said, shaking his head. "It's like they're trying to get us to doubt ourselves." Sarah sighed, rubbing her temples. "We can't let that happen. We have to stay focused. They're trying to discredit us one by one. But if we stick together, they'll have to listen." Lucas nodded, but looked uneasy. "We'll see if we can hold this together. But I'm telling you, the pressure is building." As the days passed, Sarah began to feel the weight of the situation. She wasn't just fighting for David anymore, or for fairness in the company. She was fighting for her own job, her own place in a workplace that was increasingly hostile. The stakes were higher than she had imagined, and the resistance wasn't just coming from the higher-ups. It was growing among her own colleagues as well. One afternoon, Sarah was summoned to HR again. The email was terse and formal, but she knew exactly what it meant. She had been called in to answer for the disruption caused by her efforts to push for diversity and inclusion within the company. When Sarah entered the HR office, Lisa was sitting with Ben, her assistant, both of them looking more serious than usual. "Sarah," Lisa began, her voice cool but firm, "we've been reviewing the impact of your actions over the last few weeks. The petition, the emails, the meetings. It's creating an environment of instability in the office. Ben chimed in, "It's come to our attention that your actions have caused some employees to feel uncomfortable. And more importantly, it's affecting productivity. We cannot afford to let this continue, Sarah." Sarah swallowed hard but forced herself to remain composed. "What exactly are you implying, Ben?" Lisa leaned forward, her gaze sharp. "We're not accusing you of anything, but if this continues, we may have no choice but to reconsider your position with the company. We need employees who are committed to the team's success, and right now, your actions are putting that at risk." The words hung in the air, heavy and cold. Sarah knew what they were saying without saying it outright. They were threatening her job. "Are you asking me to stop?" Sarah asked, her voice low but unwavering. Lisa's expression remained neutral. "We're asking you to consider the broader impact of your actions, Sarah. We don't want to escalate this further, but if you don't, we may need to take more formal steps." Sarah stood up, her hands clenched at her sides. "I'm not going to stop. You can't silence me just because you're uncomfortable with the truth." Lisa's face tightened. "You're making a mistake." As Sarah left the room, she felt the pressure mounting. This was no longer just about fairness. It was about survival, and she knew she had to choose whether she was going to continue this fight or back down and protect her career. The following week was one of the most difficult for Sarah. She was more isolated than ever, and the atmosphere at the office was growing toxic. People she had once considered friends were now avoiding her, and the pressure was getting to her. She had already started preparing herself for the worst. There was a real chance she could lose her job. But then, something unexpected happened. Emily called her late one night, her voice filled with excitement and urgency. "Sarah, you won't believe this. There's a whole group of employees from the other branches, marketing, finance, even some senior managers, who've been following what's been going on. And they're on our side. They want to help us push for change. They've heard the rumors, and they're backing us up. They want to join the petition." Sarah couldn't believe it. "You're serious? How do we even know we can trust them?" "We've been talking, sending messages through encrypted channels. They're ready to make this bigger. If we present a united front, we can't be ignored anymore. We have the numbers." It was the breakthrough Sarah had been waiting for. The weight of the resistance had become too much for her to carry alone. But now she had the support of people from different departments, people who could influence real change from within the company. This was no longer just an internal matter. It was a movement. The following Friday, Sarah was called into another meeting, this time with the executives. Lisa, John, and the head of HR were all sitting at the table, their faces grim. Sarah knew this wasn't going to be another simple discussion. They were going to try to squash the movement once and for all. But this time, she wasn't walking in alone. Emily, Lucas, and a few other key allies were standing behind her, their presence enough to show the company that they weren't just dealing with one disgruntled employee anymore. They were facing a united front of individuals who were ready to stand their ground. Lisa spoke first, her voice tight. "Sarah, we've asked you to reconsider your actions. Your emails, the petition. It's all a distraction. We need you to stop before this escalates further." Sarah stood tall, meeting Lisa's gaze without flinching. "I'm not going anywhere. I'm not going to stop until this company changes. If you want to fire me for speaking out, then you'll have to explain to every employee who signed that petition why you're not listening to them." Lucas stepped forward. "And we're not backing down either. This isn't just about Sarah anymore. It's about all of us. The company has failed to address these issues for years, and we won't let it continue." John's face darkened. "You're making a huge mistake. If you keep pushing this, you'll jeopardize your future here. No one wants this conflict." Sarah looked around the room, her heart pounding. "I'm not here for personal gain. I'm here for the people who have been ignored for too long. And if you can't see that, then maybe you don't deserve to be in leadership." A tense silence filled the room as everyone waited for Lisa's response. After a moment, she spoke, her voice quieter now but still firm. "We'll take this into consideration. But understand this, Sarah. We won't tolerate disruptions like this for much longer." Sarah didn't back down. "I'll take that risk." The days following the showdown in the executive meeting were some of the hardest Sarah had faced. The atmosphere at the office had shifted. It wasn't just uncomfortable anymore, it was hostile. Even the small victories she had felt earlier now seemed distant as the pressure mounted from all sides. Emily and Lucas were no longer able to avoid the personal consequences of standing beside Sarah. Rumors spread that they were instigators of the office unrest, and both had been given fewer responsibilities at work. Sarah, too, felt the walls closing in. She was no longer being invited to team meetings and found her emails ignored by her supervisors. She sat at her desk one afternoon, staring at the screen. The weight of everything, her job, her future, and the cause she had so fervently championed, felt like it was slipping away. Despite the growing number of employees who supported her efforts, the company's leadership seemed unwilling to yield. The resistance had grown stronger, and she was beginning to question if she could keep going. That's when she received a message from Emily. "It's getting bad. I overheard Lisa talking to John. If we don't back down, they'll make sure we're all sidelined. They're already planning to restructure." Sarah's heart sagged. Restructuring could mean layoffs, demotions, or worse, making the voices of her allies irrelevant. She felt herself starting to crumble, but then she reminded herself of why she started all of this. For people like David, for the ones who'd been ignored and overlooked for too long. She couldn't give up now. She typed back, "We can't stop. If we back down now, they win. We have to push harder." Emily responded quickly, "Agreed, but it might be time to escalate this. We need more attention. If we want change, we need to take a bigger step. The outside world needs to see what's happening here." The idea of bringing in external pressure had never felt like an option before. But now, with the corporate resistance so entrenched, it seemed like the only choice left. Sarah, Emily, and Lucas began quietly contacting journalists, influencers, and advocacy groups focused on diversity and inclusion. They knew that if they could get media coverage, the company would be forced to address the issues publicly. Within a week, Sarah received a response from a prominent journalist at the Corporate Tribune, an online publication that covered workplace issues and employee rights. "We'd love to hear more about what's happening at your company. We've been following your efforts and would like to discuss your story. The public needs to hear about this." Sarah felt a surge of both excitement and fear. This could be the breakthrough they needed, but it could also backfire terribly. She called Emily and Lucas to discuss. "We don't have much time," Sarah said, pacing in her apartment. "If we want to go public, we need to be prepared. There's no going back once this story hits." Lucas was apprehensive but agreed. "We can't let them silence us, but we need to make sure we have all our facts straight. The company will do everything they can to discredit us." Emily, more resolute than ever, said, "We've come this far. If they want to play dirty, we'll be ready. This is bigger than just us now." A week later, the day of the press conference arrived. Sarah, Emily, and Lucas were seated in a small but packed conference room with the journalist from the Corporate Tribune, who had arranged everything. The room buzzed with energy and anticipation. Several other employees from the company, those who had been anonymously supporting Sarah's cause, were also present, and their faces showed a mix of nervousness and determination. Sarah took a deep breath before speaking into the microphone, knowing that the world was now watching. "Thank you all for being here. My name is Sarah, and I've worked at company name for the last 3 years. I've spent those years watching a company that claims to value diversity and inclusion, but behind the scenes, it's a different story. The company's leadership has consistently failed to take meaningful action to address racial inequality, discrimination, and systemic bias." The room fell silent as Sarah spoke, her words ringing out, clear and strong. "I have been fighting not just for myself but for every employee who has been overlooked, underestimated, and pushed aside because of the color of their skin, their gender, or their background." As Sarah continued, she recounted her journey, detailing how David's mistreatment had sparked her decision to act, how her efforts to bring about change had been met with increasing hostility, and how the company's leadership had refused to acknowledge or address the systemic issues at hand. A journalist in the back raised a hand. "Can you elaborate on the company's response? How have they reacted to your efforts?" Sarah hesitated for a moment, then answered, "They've tried to silence me. They've threatened my job. They've isolated my colleagues. But the hardest part is that this isn't just a problem I face. It's a problem that's affecting everyone in the company. Employees who are afraid to speak out, employees who feel like they don't have a voice. Emily and Lucas took turns speaking, sharing their own experiences of workplace discrimination, as well as the personal sacrifices they'd made by standing with Sarah. The room, now filled with journalists, cameras, and employees, was fully engaged, and Sarah felt the weight of the moment. This was no longer just a battle within the company. It had become a public reckoning. The aftermath of the press conference was swift and intense. The company, caught off guard by the media attention, issued a statement denouncing Sarah and her supporters. They called the claims exaggerated and misleading, framing the group as disgruntled employees attempting to damage the company's reputation. Internally, the company took swift action. Several of Sarah's supporters were removed from projects, some were given less favorable work assignments, and others were given what amounted to warnings. Sarah herself was pulled aside by Lisa and Ben. "We've read the article," Lisa said, her face pale with anger. "This is unacceptable. You've aired our company's dirty laundry to the public. You've put us in a very difficult position." Sarah didn't flinch. "I didn't start this. You did, when you refused to listen to us." Ben glared at her. "You've jeopardized your future here, and the future of anyone who stood by you." Sarah stood her ground. "You can't silence me, and you can't intimidate me. This fight is bigger than all of us. It's about fairness and justice." Lisa's eyes narrowed. "We'll see how long that resolve lasts when you're out of a job." Just as the company's retaliation began to intensify, Sarah received an unexpected call from one of the company's senior executives, Michael, someone she had barely interacted with during her time at the company. "I saw the press conference," Michael said quietly, "and I'm afraid the company's response was rash. I know I can't undo what's been said, but I want you to know that there are people here who believe in what you're doing, people who understand the need for change." Sarah was stunned. "Why didn't you speak up before?" "I've been silent for too long," Michael replied, "but I can't ignore this anymore. The company has failed in many ways. I don't know what the future holds, but I want to help. We need to address this, not just for you, but for everyone." Michael's words felt like a lifeline. It was a small victory, perhaps not enough to turn the tide just yet, but it was a sign that not everyone in the company was complicit in the systemic issues. Sarah now had an ally at the highest level, someone who could influence real change from within the company's core. That evening, as Sarah sat alone in her apartment, reflecting on everything that had transpired, she realized just how much she had risked: her career, her reputation, and her peace of mind. But she also knew that she couldn't stop. If she did, all the people who had placed their trust in her, all the employees who had quietly supported the cause, would be let down. In that moment, Sarah found clarity. The fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. In the days following the press conference, the ripple effects were felt across the company. The media coverage was widespread, sparking debates within the business community and on social platforms. Social media campaigns using the hashtag #ChangeAt, company name, gained traction, and employees from other corporations began to reach out in support. It became clear that Sarah's movement was no longer confined to the company. It had become a national conversation about corporate accountability, diversity, and inclusion. Despite the growing external pressure, the company's leadership was adamant in maintaining their stance. The leadership team issued several public statements defending their position, framing Sarah's actions as divisive and harmful to the company's culture. Sarah, Emily, and Lucas, however, were undeterred. Their resolve had only strengthened. The more the company pushed back, the more people rallied behind them. Sarah had been receiving an outpouring of support from current employees, former employees, and allies in other companies. Some even suggested they organize a walkout to show the company the power of collective action. As the pressure mounted, Michael, the senior executive who had privately expressed his support, called Sarah late one evening. "I need to talk to you in person," Michael said. "There's something we need to discuss." The call left Sarah uneasy, unsure of what he was about to say. Could he be backing down, too? Or was he really going to risk his position to help her cause? The next day, Sarah met Michael in a quiet conference room, away from the prying eyes of the company's senior leadership. His face was more serious than she had ever seen it. "I've spoken with a few colleagues," Michael said, his voice low. "Some of the higher-ups are starting to realize they've made a huge mistake. We've underestimated the power of your movement. But we can't fix this internally, not without shaking things up." Sarah sat down across from him, her eyes narrowed. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that we take a drastic step. You've done more than just start a conversation. You've ignited a fire. The company's response has been a disaster. The only way forward is transparency and accountability. We need a real, internal investigation into the company's practices. I'm willing to support it, but it will take all of us to make it happen." Sarah's mind raced. This was the kind of action she had been hoping for, an official commitment to change. But it also meant she would be exposing herself even further, risking her own career and potentially losing the few allies she had left inside the company. "How do we ensure this won't be just another PR stunt?" she asked, skeptical but hopeful. "We'll need outside consultants, lawyers, and experts in diversity and inclusion to audit everything," Michael explained. "We'll open up every department, every policy, and every practice to scrutiny. It won't be easy, and it won't be quick, but if we're going to make this company genuinely better, we can't afford to sweep things under the rug." Michael's proposal was risky. It meant the company would have to publicly admit its failures, something that wasn't easy for any corporation to do. But after the public outcry and mounting external pressure, it became clear that something needed to change. The board of directors, though resistant at first, agreed to an emergency meeting to discuss Michael's plan. When Sarah was called to attend the meeting, she had no idea what the outcome would be. Would they shut her out, or would they take a meaningful step toward reform? The meeting room was packed with executives, lawyers, and external advisors. The air was tense as Lisa, John, and other senior leaders sat at the head of the table. Sarah, Emily, and Lucas were seated across from them, facing the uncomfortable reality of the moment. Lisa began, her voice stiff. "We've heard your concerns, and we recognize that there are serious issues within our company. However, we believe the damage caused by your actions has been significant." Sarah cut in, her voice steady but firm. "The damage wasn't caused by us, Lisa. It was caused by the company's failure to listen, to change, and to address the systemic problems that have existed for years. We're not the problem here." Lisa's face reddened. But before she could respond, Michael spoke up, his tone calm but authoritative. "I've spent enough time observing what's happening. This company's leadership is not equipped to solve these issues on its own. We need external guidance, transparency, and, above all, accountability." The room fell silent. It was rare for a senior executive to publicly confront the board like this, but Michael's words carried weight. Sarah's movement isn't just a protest. It's a demand for change, and we have an obligation to respond, not with excuses, but with action. John, who had been quietly fuming in the background, finally spoke. "We can't just throw ourselves into a public investigation. The fallout could ruin the company's reputation. The shareholders won't stand for it." Sarah stood, her voice unwavering. "The reputation of this company is already damaged. You're either going to act on this, or you're going to continue down a path that makes you complicit in maintaining an unjust system." Emily added, "We're not backing down. We've already given everything to this cause. It's time the company did the same." After a long silence, the chairperson of the board, an older man with an air of authority, cleared his throat. "Michael's suggestion is a bold one. It will be difficult, but I think it's the only way forward. We'll authorize an external investigation and bring in the experts to review our practices. But understand this, Sarah, this isn't a victory yet. You've made your case, but the real work begins now." The days that followed the board meeting were filled with uncertainty, but there was a newfound hope within Sarah's team. The external investigation was officially underway. Consultants, lawyers, and diversity experts had begun reviewing the company's policies, practices, and internal culture. The process was slow, but it was transparent. Reports were made public, and the company started to implement immediate changes based on the early findings. In the meantime, Sarah, Emily, and Lucas continued to push for more. They worked with the external consultants, providing them with insights and examples of the problems they had encountered firsthand. The external pressure continued to mount as more news outlets picked up on the investigation, turning the spotlight on the company's practices. David, who had been one of the first to suffer under the company's oppressive culture, was offered a new leadership role in the company's diversity and inclusion department. It was a small but significant victory that symbolized the start of the company's shift toward real change. As for Sarah, the battle was far from over. But for the first time in months, she felt a sense of accomplishment. The wheels of change were turning, and she had played a key role in starting that momentum. She knew there would still be challenges ahead. This process would take time, but now, at least, there was a real commitment from the company to address the issues. One evening, as Sarah and Emily sat in the company cafeteria, they shared a quiet moment of reflection. "You know," Emily said, "I never thought we'd get this far. It seemed impossible at first." Sarah smiled, her gaze steady. "It still feels impossible sometimes. But we've already changed things. One step at a time." Lucas joined them, his face lighting up. "I heard they're finally creating new hiring policies. Real changes are coming." The three of them looked at each other, knowing that while the fight wasn't over, the seeds of change had been planted. Weeks later, as the company made significant strides toward reform, Sarah found herself standing at the window of her apartment, looking out at the city below. The skyline felt different now. Her heart was lighter, not because the battle was over, but because she had played a part in something bigger than herself. She had started with a single, difficult decision to stand up for what was right. She had faced resistance, personal threats, and enormous pressure. But she had persisted. She picked up her phone and sent a message to David. "I think we started something big. Thank you for trusting me, and thank you for being part of this fight." As she hit send, she knew that this was just the beginning. The work of dismantling systemic injustice wouldn't be solved overnight. But now, there was a movement. There was hope.